Dr. Arthur Quinn was not a man prone to excitement. He had spent the better part of his life studying things that were invisible, the endless void of space, the twisted loops of time, the impossible dance of quantum particles. But today, as he stood in his cluttered university laboratory, surrounded by buzzing monitors and piles of scientific journals, he was vibrating with anticipation. It wasn't often that a man like Arthur, a scientist who had always been more of a theorist than a practitioner, got to actually push the boundaries of human knowledge. Yet here he was, poised to test his most ambitious experiment yet, a machine designed to replicate the power of a black hole, on a miniature scale. The device was sleek, humming with a quiet, almost imperceptible energy. Its core was a glowing sphere, encased in a force field, drawing in particles from the surrounding air as though it had a life of its own. The room smelled faintly of burnt coffee, the remnants of a late-night research binge, but Arthur hardly noticed. His mind was consumed with a singular obsession, the idea that he could finally control gravity, master the very fabric of time and space. The university had funded his research begrudgingly. Arthur had always been something of a joke, a mad scientist who got by on reputation more than results, but he was confident that today would change everything. He would show them all. "All right," Arthur muttered to himself, rubbing his hands together with excitement. His voice echoed in the empty lab. "Let's bend the universe to my will." He pressed a button on the console. The machine's core flared to life, glowing brighter and brighter as it pulled in surrounding particles with increasing intensity. The force was growing, stronger than expected, but Arthur didn't flinch. This was what he'd been preparing for. This was what he'd been destined for. His heart pounded as the sphere began to warp the air around it, twisting space itself, pulling at his body like invisible fingers. It felt exhilarating. He could feel the gravitational field thrumming against his skin, each wave an invisible tide. Arthur laughed to himself, a mad scientist cackle echoing through the room. "Unbelievable," he whispered. "I'm doing it." But then something shifted. The sphere's glow intensified, brighter than the sun, hotter than a star. Arthur's fingers danced over the controls, but it was too late. The field had gone rogue, expanding at an unpredictable rate, pulling everything around it into its orbit. Suddenly, there was a loud crack. Arthur's heart skipped a beat as a deep, guttural sound filled the air, vibrating the very atoms in the lab. His vision blurred, his ears rang. The force was too strong. He didn't even see it coming. Before he could react, he felt a sharp, burning sensation in his chest. The black hole, now a swirling mass of gravity, was pulling at him, as though it were alive and hungry. In a desperate, panicked moment, Arthur reached for the emergency shutdown button, but he was too slow. A gust of invisible wind ripped through the lab, sending papers and equipment flying. The last thing he saw before everything went dark was the sphere's bright, unfathomable light. When Arthur came to, he was lying on the cold floor, groaning. His head felt like it was stuffed with cotton. His body ached in ways he couldn't quite comprehend. For a moment, he thought it was all a dream, some terrible nightmare. But the stench of burnt metal and the weight in the air told him otherwise. Something was different. Something had changed. He pushed himself up slowly, shaking the dizziness from his head. His lab, once pristine and organized, was now a wreck. The walls were scorched, equipment scattered in a chaotic mess. But Arthur didn't pay much attention to that. His focus was on something else, the feeling inside him. Something wasn't right. As his vision cleared, he saw it. There, in the center of the room, hovering slightly above the ground, was a small sphere. But it wasn't like the one he had just been experimenting with. This one was inside him. Arthur's breath caught in his throat as he realized what had happened. The black hole, or more precisely, the miniature black hole, was no longer confined to the device. It had entered his body. The moment it touched him, everything had changed. He could feel the pull of its gravity inside him, like an invisible weight pressing on his chest. Panicked, he tried to stand, to move, but it was like wading through molasses. The very air around him seemed to thicken, becoming heavier with each passing moment. Gravity, it seemed, was no longer something he could simply observe. It was inside him, controlling him, bending his will to its whims. That he looked around, desperate to understand what had happened. There was a chair, a small wooden desk in the corner. Without thinking, he reached out with his hand, willing the objects to move. To his surprise, they did. The chair hovered, defying the laws of gravity. The desk tilted, then twisted in midair. His breath caught again. He had done it. He had become the black hole. Unbelievable, Arthur whispered to himself. I can control gravity. I can bend space. But as the euphoria of discovery hit him, something darker began to creep in. He felt an unsettling sensation, like something wasn't quite right. His hand, still extended, was trembling. The air around him seemed to distort, rippling like a mirage. And then, he saw it, the cracks in the fabric of reality. The black hole wasn't just manipulating space, it was devouring it. Everything around him began to stretch, to disappear. The edges of the room blurred, and objects vanished into the void. The desk was gone, swallowed up by the invisible force that was now eating away at everything. No, Arthur gasped, his voice trembling. No, this isn't happening, but it was. The more he concentrated, the more it grew. He was, for all intents and purposes, a walking black hole, and the world around him was being sucked in. The walls were crumbling, the air disappearing. He couldn't stop it. Panic gripped him, and without thinking, Arthur clapped his hands together, trying to bring the forces under control. For a brief, fleeting moment, it worked. The room stopped collapsing, the objects frozen in space. But then, with a sickening lurch, the gravitational field turned inward, pulling more matter, more time, into its void. No. In a split second, he had an epiphany. The black hole was alive, growing inside him, feeding off his every thought, every movement. His mind raced. There had to be a way to stop it, a way to control it. But nothing he did worked. The energy was expanding, faster than he could process, and then it hit him. If he couldn't control it, he would be consumed. His only option, it seemed, was to contain himself. Arthur stumbled backward, using every ounce of willpower to create a field, something to hold the black hole in check. The sphere inside him was pulling at everything, threatening to break apart the very fabric of his reality. His skin was prickling, his vision swimming as he summoned an energy field, an artificial shackle, around himself to hold it in place. It wasn't perfect. It wasn't even close. But it worked, for now, and as he stood there, sweating and panting, the reality of his situation sank in. He was no longer just Arthur Quinn, scientist. He was something far more dangerous, something far more powerful. And the world, his world, was slipping away from him. Arthur Quinn was trapped, suffocating under the weight of his own creation. The force inside him was relentless, an insatiable hunger that pulled at his very being. He could feel the black hole growing, spreading, expanding at an exponential rate. It wasn't just a physical force, it was a force that twisted the very fabric of his mind. It played tricks on him, whispered threats, and manipulated his perception of time itself. His hands were shaking. Sweat dripped down his face. His lab, his life's work, was vanishing around him. The walls were warping, rippling like a mirage in the heat of a desert. His eyes flickered from object to object, watching them dissolve into nothingness. The air itself seemed to bend and crack, as if the universe was reaching its breaking point. Desperation clawed at him. He had to do something, anything, to stop it, but his thoughts were fragmented, his body trembling with the strain of holding the energy field in place. He didn't have the luxury of time. He had to think. He had to act. But no matter how hard he concentrated, no matter how much he willed himself to regain control, the gravitational shackle he had created was only holding the chaos at bay. The black hole, though contained within him, was still a growing, voracious force. Every breath he took seemed to draw in more, every beat of his heart pushed more matter into the void that it was like holding back an ocean with a single thread. Arthur stumbled across the wreckage of his lab, his mind barely functional as he fought to keep himself anchored in spacetime. He could hear the hum of the machine, still running, still feeding into the gravitational pulse that now thrummed through his veins. A low, ominous growl filled his ears, a sound he was starting to associate with the growing black hole inside of him. It wasn't just that it was pulling things in, it was distorting them. Objects that were supposed to be stable, solid, were becoming fluid. He could see it in the way the desk was shifting, the way the edges of his lab were warping, like the horizon of a distant world was blurring and bending toward him. His own hand, when he looked at it, seemed to flicker in and out of existence, like he wasn't entirely there. The worst part was that he could feel it. The black hole wasn't just devouring the material world, it was eating him. It gnawed at his very essence, pulling him apart at the molecular level. Every thought was a battle against the gnawing sensation of entropy. It felt as though his mind was being stretched and compressed, split and rejoined in impossible ways. His memories were blurring together. His sense of self, his very humanity, was slipping away like sand through an open fist. He wasn't just at risk of losing his body. He was at risk of losing his soul. His breath came in ragged gasps, and for a moment, he let himself stop. He leaned against the remains of his desk, the metal still warm from the energy of the black hole. His mind reeled with the possibilities, with the understanding that he was, in fact, the only one who could stop this. There was no one else. His colleagues, his peers, none of them had any idea of the magnitude of what he had done. They'd laughed at his theories, dismissed his warnings. But now, it was too late. There was no undoing what had been set in motion. Arthur clenched his jaw, fighting to push the panic back down. He was a scientist, not a quitter. He had to find a way to fix this. He stared down at his hands, the ones that had once drawn up equations and crafted complex theories. Now, they were the hands of a man caught in the throes of an unimaginable force, a force that was far beyond anything he could have anticipated. His hands trembled, but he forced himself to steady them. He could control this. He had to. He reached into his mind, digging deep for any scrap of knowledge, any thread of understanding that could give him the key to escape. And then, he thought of it. The tether, the shackle that he had created to contain the black hole. If he could just reinforce it, extend its range, maybe, just maybe, he could contain the chaos before it consumed him completely. His heart pounded in his chest as he focused, calling up every ounce of willpower to strengthen the energy field around him. He felt the gravitational force inside him tremble in response, as if it were aware of his efforts. It resisted. Of course it did. The black hole wasn't just a physical force, it was a sentient thing, alive in its own way. It had an intelligence, a desire to grow, to expand, to consume. The more he fought it, the more it fought back. His thoughts began to scatter again, but he forced them into order. The shackle. The energy field. He focused on the idea of locking the force in place, creating a barrier that would hold it back. He could feel the pulse of the black hole inside him, a rapid beat like the thumping of a heart, and he concentrated on that rhythm, trying to synchronize his thoughts with it. For a moment, it seemed to work. The world around him stilled, and the hum of the machine quieted. He let out a breath he hadn't realized he was holding. But the relief was short-lived. The black hole, though contained for the moment, was still growing. He could feel it, raging inside of him, eager to burst free. He had bought himself a little time, but time was running out. The lab, once his sanctuary, was now his prison. His shackles weren't just physical, they were mental. The black hole inside him was like a living thing, a parasite, feeding off his very existence. He was losing himself, piece by piece. There was no denying it anymore. He wasn't just Arthur Quinn anymore. He was something else entirely. He was still grappling with this terrifying realization when he heard the faint sound of footsteps outside the door. His heart skipped. Had someone come to investigate the disaster? He had no idea how much time had passed, but he couldn't afford to let anyone else know about the mess he had created. If they found him now, if they saw him in this state, they would try to contain him, put him in a lab, run tests, dissect him. The last thing he needed was anyone else complicating the situation. Arthur pushed himself to his feet, steadying himself against the crumbling wall. He couldn't afford to panic. He couldn't afford to let the black hole take him completely. He had to find a way out, but as the footsteps grew closer, a voice called out from behind the door, sending a chill down his spine. "Arthur," the voice said. "Arthur, are you in there? It's Calloway. I saw the readings, your experiment, it's out of control. We need to." Arthur's heart froze. Dr. Edward Calloway. His rival. The man who had mocked him, belittled him, laughed at his theories and ideas. And now, it seemed, Calloway had finally come to see the disaster firsthand. Arthur gritted his teeth. He couldn't let Calloway in. Not now. If anyone else learned the truth of what was happening, it would be the end of everything. He was the only one who knew what had gone wrong, and the only one who could fix it. With every ounce of strength, he called on the last vestiges of his control and threw a force field around the door, locking it with a pulse of gravitational energy. Calloway's footsteps stopped suddenly, but Arthur didn't allow himself to focus on him. He had bigger problems that he needed to find a way to reverse what he had done, to undo the damage before the entire world was sucked into his gravity well. But how? Arthur's mind raced. There had to be a way. And then, a thought hit him, a chilling, desperate thought. What if he could sacrifice himself? What if he could release the gravitational force in such a way that it would reset the world? Maybe he could shut down the black hole, expel the energy, and in doing so, erase the damage. He could give up his own existence, allow himself to be consumed entirely by the black hole, in the hopes that it would undo the destruction he had caused. It was the only way, he realized. The only choice. Arthur's breath came in shallow gasps as he stared at the door, the faint echo of Calloway's voice still ringing in his ears. The gravitational shackle around him pulsed with a cold, oppressive energy, a reminder of the chaos he had unleashed. His hand still trembled from the force of his last effort to contain the black hole within him, but the lab had quieted for a moment. The ripples of destruction had subsided, just enough for him to think, but thinking was becoming harder. He could feel it, the black hole inside him, an insatiable force, gnawing at his insides. It was no longer something he controlled, it was something that used him. His thoughts were dissolving in the gravity well, slipping away like sand through an open fist. The more he tried to grasp at his own mind, the more it twisted, time was distorting, memories warping, and his identity was becoming a fluid thing, a shadow slipping between two worlds. He turned back to the lab, his body dragging like lead. The room was barely recognizable. What had once been a place of careful calculations and quiet triumphs had now become a haunted space, a tomb, perhaps, for the man who had once been Arthur Quinn. The walls were scorched, and the machines, which had hummed with the promise of discovery, were now dead, blackened husks. Everything was slipping into the void, even the air itself seemed thinner, like the space between atoms was no longer stable. Calloway's voice came again, muffled through the door. "Arthur, I'm going to break this down if you don't respond. You've lost control. This thing, whatever it is, it's going to collapse everything. The readings are off the charts. We have no idea what you've done." Arthur felt his jaw tighten. Calloway. The one person who would never understand. The one person who would see this as a problem to be fixed, to be contained. But there was no fixing it anymore. No containment. The black hole inside him was no longer a simple scientific anomaly, it was a living thing, a force of nature that he had unleashed into the universe. And now, it was far beyond his control. And yet, something still remained in him, a flicker of thought, a glimmer of self, and it was that spark that drove him forward. His mind had splintered, yes. His grip on reality was fading. But he wasn't gone yet. Arthur's eyes darted to the shattered remnants of his research materials scattered across the floor. Papers, notes, calculations, all of it was meaningless now. It didn't matter. He could feel the gravity pulling everything in, warping everything, and yet, in the midst of this swirling chaos, he could hear a faint whisper of something, the solution. He stumbled toward his desk, his vision flickering. The gravitational shackle around him strained, its force field weakening under the strain. Every step he took felt like it was being dragged through mud. The black hole, deep within him, was screaming, demanding more power, more matter, more time. And Arthur felt the weight of it pressing down on his chest, threatening to crush him. He had to act. He had to do something drastic. Arthur placed his hands on the remnants of his desk. A sharp, piercing thought broke through the chaos: sacrifice. He couldn't stop the black hole. It was too big, too powerful now. But maybe, just maybe, he could shut it down by allowing it to consume him completely. He had been playing God with the very fabric of spacetime. He had been arrogantly tinkering with forces beyond human understanding. And now, he would have to pay the price. He didn't know how to reverse the process, but he had an idea, an untested, desperate one. If he could channel the gravitational force inward, if he could feed the black hole every last bit of energy inside him, maybe it would collapse, reset, and undo the destruction. Maybe the universe would rebalance itself. It was a death sentence, but in his gut, Arthur knew it was the only way. He closed his eyes, and for a moment, he could almost feel himself floating. The black hole inside him seemed to pause, as though it too had realized what was about to happen. He could sense its hunger, its insatiable thirst for matter, time, and existence. It didn't want to be extinguished. It didn't want to die. But Arthur wasn't asking for permission. He had no choice. With all the strength he could muster, he focused inward. He could feel the force of the black hole twisting in response to his will, fighting him, trying to push against the energy he was calling up. His body screamed in protest, every cell in his being rebelling against the idea of self-destruction. But he couldn't let up. He had to press forward, had to pull all his fragmented energy and force into the singularity that was now his prison. Arthur called on the very core of his being, his thoughts, his memories, his humanity, and sent them to the black hole. He fed it everything, the knowledge he had worked a lifetime to accumulate, the arrogance, the ambition, the pride. His failures. His regrets. His moments of doubt. And then, the strangest thing happened. The black hole paused. For a fleeting moment, there was silence, absolute stillness. It was like a breath held, the universe waiting. And then, without warning, the energy inside him detonated. A wave of force surged outward, and for the briefest of seconds, Arthur felt his entire existence tear apart. The gravitational field around him collapsed. His shackles, the force fields that had bound the black hole to him, shattered like glass. Time bent and stretched. He felt himself being pulled, stretched, and dissolved into the void. His body fragmented into pure energy, scattered across the infinite fabric of the universe. It was a strange, beautiful thing, the sensation of falling without ever hitting the ground. Of existing and not existing in the same moment. The last remnants of his consciousness slipped away like a fading dream, and then, nothing. When Arthur awoke, he was no longer in his lab. He was nowhere. It was as though the very concept of space had collapsed, and in its place, there was only a vast, empty expanse, an infinite void. He was neither here nor there, and yet, in this nothingness, he felt an overwhelming peace. He could no longer feel the black hole inside him. There was no weight, no pull. Just a profound silence, and then, a voice that wasn't a voice in the traditional sense. It was more like a presence, a whisper that brushed against the edges of his mind. Arthur Quinn, it said, and the sound of his name carried an ancient weight. He tried to respond, but no words came. Instead, he simply felt your choice was inevitable, the voice continued. You have undone the damage you caused, reset the flow of time. But in doing so, you have, the voice paused, as though considering its next words carefully, become something more. Arthur's mind swirled, and slowly, he began to understand. The black hole, the force that had consumed him, had been transformed. In giving himself to the void, Arthur had become a part of it. A guardian, perhaps. A witness to the boundaries of space and time that he didn't know how long he was there, in that infinite expanse, but eventually, he became aware of the world again. The universe was still turning, still unfolding. And somewhere, deep within it, Arthur Quinn's legacy had been rewritten, not as a man who sought power, but as a force of balance, a quiet sentinel watching over the fabric of existence. And then, like a dream fading on the edge of consciousness, Arthur Quinn was no longer a man. He was a whisper, a ripple in the void, a fleeting thought that would never be fully understood, but always remembered. The universe moved on, and so did he.